Good evening to everyone, and welcome to this session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series, organized by the Institute of Islamic Studies. As its title says, the lecture series welcomes scholarly talks and discussions in various fields of Islamic studies related to the broad area of interest of the Institute. The announcements of lectures are available at the Institute of Ismaili Studies website and are also advertised through various community and scholarly mailing lists. So if you're interested in being updated on these and other events at the Institute, you can subscribe to the IES newsletter. My name is Orkan Mirkasimov. I am Associate Professor at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guests today. Thank you both for joining us. So Dr. David Bennett is our speaker today. And he's not exactly a guest, since he is assistant professor and teaching and learning coordinator at the Institute. His research interests include the early Mu'tazilites, heresiography and religious plurality, philosophy of mind, and the Arabic tradition, dreams, illusions, and madness. His recent publications have been on cognizable content, me'ani, sense perception, and light-dark dualism in Islamic sources. He is currently committed to a translation of Al-Ash'ari's Maqalat for the Library of Arabic Literature. Dr. Peter Adamson is our discussant. Peter Adamson's primary areas of interest are philosophy in late antiquity and Arabic philosophy. His two monographs deal with the Arabic version of Plotinus, the so-called Theology of Aristotle, and with Al-Kindi. He has devoted articles to several figures of the Greek tradition, Aristotle, Plotinus, and Porphyry, and others, and numerous philosophers of the Arabic tradition, including Al-Kindi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, Yahya ibn Adi, Miskawayh, Avicenna, and Vagaries. He has also edited and co-edited several books, including In the Age of Vagaries, published by the Warburg Institute, the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy, and Interpreting Avicenna, Critical Essays for Cambridge University Press. In 2012, Professor Adamson moved to Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich from King's College London, which is the home of the research project he oversees on natural philosophy in the Islamic world. And he is also host of the very successful History of Philosophy podcast, which feeds into history of philosophy without any gaps. Volumes published by Oxford University Press, I think since 2014. 6 volumes. So yeah, please, Peter, feel free to complete or update anything. It's all right. Yeah. So the topic of Dr. Bennett's talk today is time for atoms. And to give you an idea of timelines, we will start with Dr. Bennett's talk, which will last about 30-40 minutes, followed by a discussion led by Dr. Adamson and questions from the audience. So the whole session today should take between 1 hour and 1 hour and a half. For our online audience, if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box and not the chat, because we won't be able to monitor the chat. And I want to apologize in advance if we will not have enough time to answer all the questions, but we will do our best. So thank you, and please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Orkan. And that's nonsense. Of course, we're going to answer all of the questions. Yeah. All the good questions, anyway. So thank you to this institute, first of all, for allowing me to give this talk, for the series of lectures that we're in, which is an invaluable resource to people in the field, continuing and like we're accumulating more and more scholarship into this series of lectures that are all accessible online on YouTube. So if anybody wants to go back and see other ones, or if you want to just leave this one and watch it later, you're welcome to do that. Thank you. No, not you, Omar. So thank you. Thank you also to everyone online for joining. I know that it's weird to have a hybrid conference. It's definitely weird for me to give a hybrid talk to people that I can't see and don't know exist. But that's part of our theological problem after all. So thank you again, and thank you to Dr. Adamson for being so kind for coming here. Dr. Adamson and I go way back. When I first got my first job after my PhD, it's because Dr. Adamson saw me at an institute that you might know, the Institute of Ismaili Studies, when it was on Euston Road. So I met him there and gave a talk that was no doubt confused and alarming, but he saw some potential and gave me a job here at King's College London, and I've still been hanging on despite the attempts of UKVI to send me to Rwanda. Just a tip for those of you under that threat: marry somebody, but not a European. That doesn't work anymore. So today's talk is on atoms, which is something that just doesn't come up in ordinary life for some reason. And I'm here to correct that illusion. First of all, let's look at this picture that I've chosen. Obviously, I had to go with giraffes because of Dr. Adamson. We all love giraffes. They're the paragons of they're the paragons of beauty in the natural world. They're tall, they have beautiful sticky tongues. They have so many appendages on their heads that you wouldn't believe. They have horns and ears and so on. They're gorgeous creatures. What is the difference between those two giraffes? That's the first question for today. Did somebody say gender? It's like that's a different talk that I'm not going to get into. But the difference, there is some difference, we know, because there's numerically two giraffes. We don't know these giraffes. We don't know them from Adam, so to speak. It's not a pun, it's with atom. It was just an accident. We don't know, it's an expression. We don't know them from Adam. We don't know one giraffe from another, but we suspect that there's something significantly different between these two giraffes. It's such an elemental, like annoying philosophical question, what the difference is between two members of the same genus, two individuals of the same species, that it seems like a joke, but it's not a joke. What specifically is the difference between these two giraffes? Is it their memories, their personal experiences? The one giraffe saw the other giraffe's mother naked when it was a teenager or something like that? Is there some specific thing that differentiates them? Or is it imbued in their skin somehow? Is it because that giraffe has this many more spots than that other giraffe, and so on? We all intuit that there's a major difference, and that difference is that they have different selves, different souls, the same way that you are different from the person sitting next to the person sitting next to you. Presumably, like, you know that you're different, right? You have your personal view. You assume that other entities have this personal view of the universe that does not allow for anybody else sharing your selfhood. The problem is that in theology and philosophy, somebody does share your selfhood. Whether you're a Neoplatonist and it's the active intellect, or you're a monotheist and it's God itself, somehow your distinct selves are shared with everybody else. It's an intuition that we also have, and it's conflicting. Now, normally we manage to bridge this gap by creating some sort of a metaphysics, some way of saying like, well, provisionally I'm a self. Provisionally for now, I'm a self. Of course, when it comes to time, the question is, am I the same self over time? Look at these giraffes again. They haven't moved because they're a photograph. They're not real giraffes. But you can imagine that these giraffes were once little baby giraffes, and eventually they're going to be old and decrepit giraffes. I just remember, so like, I just wanted to say, if Professor Qasim is here, I'm wearing my trousers. I don't know if you can see that, but like, so these giraffes will change over time. They'll wear, what I meant is they'll wear different clothes over time, the same way that we will pick up different parts of the rest of the world to demonstrate our individuality and our sameness to the rest of the world. I've been working on this for a long time, and it seems to me that like this is one of those annoying questions that you ask in parties when no one else will talk to you, and then no one talks to you anymore. But identity and differentiation is at the heart of our understanding of the universe. It's why we make distinctions between the people around us. It's why we, decide who we love. It's why we decide why we're going to go to work today, for instance. What day is today? How is today different from tomorrow? How are things that are ostensibly the same metaphysically different in real life? How is one giraffe different from another? So in theory, when we talk about kalām is the rational theological discourse that emerged in Islam in the 7th century, 8th century, basically. It's a technical term for those of you that are not practitioners of kalām here. I don't know if everyone is not a mutakallim, but if you're not a practitioner, what it means is just basically talking. The word in Arabic just means discourse. It's not a threatening word. I have been working on it for a while, and I have some funny pictures for you. So this is me with a skip in London from like 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I was so proud to find this skip. Turns out that kalām is also just a normal Pakistani last name. I didn't know this at the time. I thought it was a big deal. I was like, I found the kalām skip. This is where I can put all my kalām. But the term, so I show this just to show you how long I've been working on this very problem. How it is that people talk in a theological discourse about the distinctions between individuals. And I've been doing this because I accidentally came across early kalām as a young, confused person, and then I just got stuck on it. The reason that I'm stuck on it is because the problems are insoluble. The problems about the nature of individual giraffes, about time, place, and so on, are tricky and annoying. However, when we talk about kalām in Islamic thought, when we're giving a course, for instance, on the introduction to Islam, as many of you are doing as student teachers and so on, and many in the audience have been in the position where you've had to give the Intro to Islam talk. How do you discuss Islamic theology? Well, you certainly don't bring up kalām. You bring up the Quran, the Hadith. You bring up the actual sources for Islamic religiosity. You bring up practices and cultural disciplines and so on. You might bring in Sufism. You'll probably skip over kalām to get to falsafa because kalām is like the unwanted stepchild of Islam. But kalām is filled with the kinds of thoughts that are simply integral to the nature of theological speculation. And that's why we call it speculative theology. Some of the things that kalām talks about is, besides the nature of the individual, the nature of God's attributes. So most famously, so just to clarify, when we talk about Islamic theology, there's no such thing. There's the Quran and Hadith, and then there's a few weirdos in the 9th, 10th, and 11th century who practice what is called kalām. There's no doctrine of kalām. There's no single kalām. Kalām is just a discipline that we participate, the same way of saying like, there's some philosophers out there. There's some mutakallimun out there. The traditional way of describing kalām is to talk about the two most famous schools, and this is like Islam 101 that everyone hears, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'arites. It's a little bit confusing because al-Ash'ari himself, who died in 934 CE, that's just a wild guess, somewhere around there. Anyway, al-Ash'ari himself was a Mu'tazilite. The Mu'tazilites were a group of early kalām specialists, more or less. but they were just a group of people that got given a title, the same way that you might call somebody, I don't know, this is a bad example, but an atheist or something like that. It doesn't mean that all atheists think the same way. They just are called Mu'tazilites. Surrealists would be a better example. The typical distinction between the two is something that we always hear when we're hearing about the history of Islamic thought, is that for Mu'tazilites, they believed in free will, and Ash'arites did not. Black and white. Traditionally, Mu'tazilites are thought to think of God's attributes as being metaphorical. So when God talks in the Quran about his wajh, he doesn't mean his face, he means his mercy, his blessings, and so on. And that's something that appeals to us as Ismailis more than to say Sunnis who are more influenced by the Ash'ari tradition. So if you take everything about God literally in the Quran, about God in the Quran literally, you'll end up with a lot of interesting problems like God sitting on an arsh or God having hands and so on. So since I'm looking around this room and I see a lot of Ismailis and I don't see any Sunnis, I think it's safe to say that we all interpret those attributes metaphorically. But that was not guaranteed from the beginning, of course. And that's not guaranteed by the text of the Quran. There is no necessary reason to say that, oh, well, the Quran is just talking here. It's just using a manner of speech. This is the traditional distinction between the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites. So invariably, when we're teaching Islamic theological ideas, we base all of our discussion on these two kinds of themes: freedom of the will and the divine attributes. And oh my God, I've talked about them so much that I can almost, like, it's, so, you know, in philosophy, right, the thing in Islamic philosophy, the problem that is added to all of this is whether the world was created in time or was eternal. I always say that there's no beginning to this question. I mean, it's just like, it's the most annoying question imaginable. Human free will is also very annoying. What actually is applicable in human free will to what I'm going to talk about today is, remember our giraffes. Is the choice of one giraffe distinct from the choice of another? Imagine the choices available to your average giraffe. They don't sin, presumably. I don't actually. Well, this is an animal thing, right? Do animals sin? I'll have to talk about.
Even if they did, giraffes.
Giraffes definitely. Cats, on the other hand. But so when a giraffe chooses to, this is my giraffe, and when a giraffe chooses to eat a leaf, is that choice by that giraffe different from this other choice of this other giraffe to eat another leaf? Like, what is the distinction there? Is it just a distinction of what we call a numerical distinction, where like this leaf is different numerically from this other leaf, but the choice itself is the same thing: eat leaf, get giraffe food, something like that. Where was I? I got distracted by the giraffe metaphor again, which will happen occasionally. I'm sorry. When we talk about free will, we generally mean an individual right to make a choice of our own. And we have this impression about free will that it's something that we're given, something that distinguishes us from, say, rocks, which can do one thing: fall towards the center of the earth. That's the only thing that a rock can do. Does it have ikhtiyar? Does it choose to fall? But it has the power to fall. That's its only power. So somehow we distinguish between our powers and the powers of a rock, because our powers seem to involve some sort of at least binary, hopefully more than two choices. However, the weird thing about all of this is that Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites, despite having this long-standing, like, legendary dispute about whether or not humans have the freedom to act, or whether God knows by virtue of his omniscience, its omniscience or its omnipotence, what you're going to do tomorrow. Despite all of these supposed differences, both traditions are rooted in a single thing, and I think that this is the fundamental impulse at the heart of kalām. And you can guess what that is, because it's in the title of my talk. It's atomism. It's the understanding of the entire universe as composed of two basic kinds of things: atoms, jawāhir in Arabic, and accidents, arad. So accidents and atoms are terrible English words for this. This comes because of bloody Aristotelians, as usual. So we've just had to come up with some way of talking about these terms. In Aristotelian Arabic philosophy, jawāhir becomes the substance, the ousia in Greek. But the specific kalām term for what an atom is the particle that has no subdivision, the particle that cannot be subdivided, the juz alladhi la yatajazza. So often they use the term jawāhir synonymously with this. Now, as I said before, in kalām there is no single kalām doctrine. So invariably, because it's kalām, you're going to have 27 opinions about what a single term means. So not every one of them is going to say that an atom is a jawāhir and a jawāhir is a body and so on. But they belong to the same category. The category here is a thing in which accidents inhere. Accidents are properties. So if we take a very basic vision of atomism, what we end up with is that there are bodies, colorless, nameless, formless almost bodies that acquire attributes. In the typical presentation of atomism, you'll talk about, say, we have this table with this black cloth on it, right? So the cloth, I don't know if people online can see me, but there's a table here with the black cloth. So the cloth is made out of some sort of a fabric, and it's given this attribute of blackness. The blackness is an accident, which inheres somehow in the substance of the cloth. We're so far so good, right? Now, what about the softness and the hardness of the various things that we're talking about? What about the length and width of it? Where do these accidents actually inhere in this substance or atom or whatever you want to call it, this jawāhir? Well, in the case of atomism, it's discussed at length in kalām. It's not exactly clear where they inhere. It's not clear whether you actually get a body in which these accidents inhere. So for instance, my pinkness inheres not just in the atoms of my skin, but in me as a person. That's some sort of substantial atomism where we start saying that there's some pinkness here in this area. To a very determined atomist, and I mean that in a sense of being like very doctrinaire atomist, they might say that no, what's actually happening is that there's a lot of atoms here and each one of them is pink. Each one of them is soft, except for this one, which is sort of hard, and this one, which is more hairy than the other one, and so on. And then it becomes very difficult because you could sort of conceive of a situation in which somebody could just whack me just right on the arm and knock off all my pink atoms. Or you could go in there surgically and remove them, the way that surgeons actually do, removing cancerous cells, for instance. You remove things that don't have the attribute that you don't want. In reality, of course, it's almost impossible to control the accidents that atoms or bodies have. In reality, we can't perform alchemy, despite all of the best attempts of people in the 8th and 9th centuries. We can't change the way that things actually appear. So we're stuck with atoms or bodies with a certain set of properties. I'm saying this in the most general way possible because, of course, for some atomists, it was slightly different. The real question, though, is this atomism, this atom and accident divide is something that applies across the entire cosmos. And what's more, it matches perfectly the way that we talk about God, if we're a mutakallim. God is God. That's his jawāhir. His accidents are the sifat, the attributes of God. Right? So the question then becomes, well, wait a second. If these are accidents or attributes of God, they're distinct from God. And this is what led into the previous issue about metaphorically understanding God's attributes. Fortunately, I don't have to talk about God's attributes today. I can only talk about human attributes or thing attributes. So when a body has a certain set of attributes and we can't actually define where the limit is, it seems already kind of annoying, but it's going to get more annoying than that. Because imagine for just a moment that we've reduced the entire world into bodies or atoms with accidents or properties. I have to just keep being equivocal about this language, because every time I say it, I just think of the one Muʿtazilite who disagrees with everything that I'm saying. There's always one. One of the issues is that accidents, for instance, are not just black, hard, bumpy, hairy. Sometimes they're more complicated than that. There's hot, there's cold. What about accidents of color that don't actually have opposites? What about the difference between, say, remember those two giraffes? What accidents do they have that are distinct? Well, there's the orangeness of this giraffe, which is slightly different from the orangeness of this other giraffe, and so on. But there's also elements of each body which are distinct, not just numerically, but substantially. Meaning that the color of my pinkness is distinct from, sorry, Rob's pinkness. I'm just trying to find another pinkish person. So, like, it's not the same pinkness. It never is. Not even the blackness, I mean, ask an artist. Not even the blackness of this cloth is the same as the blackness of some other cloth. No accident is ever going to match perfectly other accidents. And yet somehow jawāhirs, the things in which they adhere, are all essentially the same. So Rob and I are both humans. Those giraffes are both giraffes, right? But all of their accidents are different. That's one of the problems. Like I said, there's more substantial problems. More substantial problems involve those accidents that don't belong to the physical world. So, Rob, imagine a human being that has sweet qualities, not sweet like the taste of him, but like his nature is sweet. He's a good person. His goodness, according to this tradition, is an accident. It's obviously not essential to him. It's something that he had to cultivate in some sense. But it's what makes him different over time. For instance, when he was a baby, he was a jerk. But now as an adult, he's a sweet man. But he's not changed substantially. There's just been an accidental change. These qualities are different from his pinkness, which will stay the same. I'm sorry. It's part of being white. Over time. The difference is some accidents are immeasurable in some sense. And we say them only of human beings because they have souls or whatever we want to say about them. And this is where people start to say, okay, atomism just doesn't do it for me anymore because it doesn't explain how souls are different. It does explain pretty well how tables are different. It's good on tables. But when it comes to souls, it becomes more tricky. So the sweetness or the qualities that are sort of non-physical, you would say, the kindness, the love that you would have for a Rob, I'm trying to think of I've been thinking about atoms for so long, I can't think of non-substantial elements or properties, but there's many of them, you guys know, right? So there's fear, pain. Oh, that's a good one, pain. I'll use pain. So the pain that somebody feels is an accident. It's transitory, thank goodness. And it's something that that affects the body without changing the body. In some cases, it does change individual atoms and so on. But for the most part, you're going to have a hurt elbow for a while, and then that is going to stop. But it's not something that will change you substantially. It is weird to think of that as adhering in bodies the same way that blackness does. So if you can imagine my table example or my arm example of like pink, 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 hairy, 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 hard, soft, whatever, if you add some pain in there, where does it go? Does it go on top of all of the other accidents? Is it super added? Is it part of a larger, are these things all just dumped in a soup that make me up? Atoms work in a strange way. What I found, the more that I researched atoms, is that the way that we think about them is alien to the way that Kalām thought about them. We think about them as saying like, oh, we have to deal with these psychological problems and explain how this physical system can accommodate these psychological issues. And so the solution that I came up with when I was a graduate student, when I was little, was that I'm using my dissertation, by the way, just as inspiration for those of you that are working on dissertations. So I thought that, well, one of the ways to look at atomism was to think about it in terms of things not having any substrate at all, but rather accidents just floating in the world. this is based on a particular reading of a particular Muʿtazilite that I had at the time, an Adham, who said that all that there was in the world were atoms and accidents. Yes, but the only accident is motion. Everything else is a jawāhir. And by that, he meant that the blackness of the table is a jawāhir, the hardness of your arm is a jawāhir, the kindness of your mother is a jawāhir, the pain in your elbow is a jawāhir. And that these jawāhirs are all intermixed in the world. The problem with this view is that it meant that nothing is actually in a particular place. Because once you start admitting of place, then you start creating these metaphysical constructs that go beyond what atomism actually offers. Atomism only gives you, only gives you bodies and accidents. Greek atomism gave you the void, which was not particularly helpful. It gave you atoms plummeting in a void. It turns out that giving any kind of a substrate to atoms was problematic. So I came up with this, what I thought was just brilliant, was a term. It turns out that the only person that read my dissertation was Gregor Schwab. Any Gregor Schwab fans? It's a joke because Gregor Schwab reads everything in the universe. He's like the, yeah. He's probably listening to us right now. So I came up with this term, ahypokaimonical, which did not catch on. So what I meant from that was the hypokaimenon is the substrate in Greek. It's the thing underlying everything, any kind of attribution of anything. So the hypokaimenon is that in which things inhere. And I thought that I had found in early kalām a kind of physics that didn't actually have a substrate, that simply had free-flowing accidents. Free-flowing accidents are very exciting, but they're very problematic. And it goes back to those two giraffes. Because if there's free-flowing accidents, that means that the colors of those giraffes happen to inhere in some atoms, but without any particular difference between the nature of the two giraffes. You simply have this kind of orangeness here, this kind of blackness here, this kind of leaf stickiness here, this kind of tongue here. There's no substrate in which they inhere. So I thought that for a second I had found this. It turns out that I had, and this dissertation was wrong, but fortunately nobody read it. The next step in my investigation was to look at those things that an Adham considered to be accidents. An Adham, by the way, was a 9th century Muʿtazilite of some repute because he was supposedly against atomism, whereas in fact, he actually supported a vision of jawāhirs that I had just described, of everything being a property body, interpenetrating every other property body. So I'm sorry for that explanation, but the problem of accidents involved the problem of motion. And this is where we get to the topic of my paper, with like 5 minutes left to talk. That it would seem that the main problem with atomism is that it doesn't allow for motion in any substantial way. It doesn't allow for time. And what I'm going to argue from here on for the rest of my time is that in fact, atomism allows for a conception of time that is more conducive to change than any other physical system. It's just conducive to change in a different way than we thought was coming. So Hisham ibn al-Hakam, who's familiar to Imami theologians as an early Imami figure, said that motions and other acts, such as standing, sitting, willing, aversion, obedience, disobedience, and whatever else is posited by those who posit accidents as such, are attributes of bodies. They are neither bodies themselves nor anything else. He did not claim that the attributes of the human being are things, for things are bodies, according to him. He claimed that they are ma'ani, not things. Motion is a ma'ana, but resting is not a ma'ana. Okay, this is our problem now. Now somebody has introduced something that is not a body or an accident, a ma'ana. A ma'ana just means like it's a conceptual entity of some kind. If you say it all the time, you say yani, that means it means. Or in Persian, by the way, they say yani chi, which is one of the most hilarious expressions, isn't it? Because it's like not Persian, but they say it all the time. Yani chi. It is Persian now, but even though it's a conjugated verb in a different language, it's Persian. Power. So that, but it is funny though that it's instead of mana. What is the mana of that? Anyway, mana is something that is not described yet, but will be in like the sequel of this talk at some point. My point here is only to think of the difference between motion as an accident and resting as an accident. So I'm bringing this up because I want to talk about time. And I think that time is traditionally the way that we have found challenges to atomism. We're all okay with each other being made out of atoms and accidents, but what we're not okay with is change. And this is something that we owe to Aristotle, because the problem with atomism is that it doesn't really acknowledge how change occurs. I mentioned the sweetness of rub over time, but the real problem is, say you take a piece of paper, this is where I would demonstrate if we were allowed, and light it on fire. So at what point does the flame touch the paper and turn it into fire? At some point, it's going to have to transition between the fire and the physical paper and create some sort of a change. Now, in Aristotelian metaphysics, that's quite easy to do. But in atomism, that means that at some point, fire has to touch something and then go across some sort of a border and then transform the accidents of everything around it. And that means that accidents can change willy-nilly. At what point would the atoms of your body, for instance, be affected by the heat outside? Would they all be affected at once? Would one of them be affected before others? And if that one was affected before others, then that atom was distinctly different from all the other atoms in your body. The lucky hot atom, you might say. Sorry, all that to say that motion is a massive problem, supposedly, for atomists, until you start reading what Mutakalimun actually say about motion, which is that motion is not either, it's not part of the system. It is neither an accident nor an atom. And Nadam said that it was an accident, but it was his only accident. The way that it's described is as being a conceptual property, motion. So when I move from this side of the podium to this side of the podium, something is inhering in me, but it's not an accident. And in fact, it's not real, according to the kalām system. Why? And this is where we get to my three topics for today, which is that atomism is all about the momentary experience. That sounds, at first, that sounds sort of like cool, but then you start thinking about it, it's like not cool at all, because that means that that your existence one moment from now is totally different from another existence. But this is where you might have heard of al-Ash'ari al-Ghazali and the Ash'arite tradition generally, which is of God's continuous recreation of the universe. How does God recreate the universe? By instituting the property of baqa, of remaining in atoms over time. So for Mu'tazilites, baqa and fana, your favorite concepts from early kalām school. I mean, everyone knows fana here because of Sufism, but the baqa, and this baqa din is here, but like the baqa is, al-Baqi is one of the names of God, the remainer, the thing that makes things remain or remains itself. Fana is the loss of things. It's the coming to be and the going away of things. In kalām, baqa and fana are accidents. In other words, when God makes something exist, first he has to make it exist, God has to make it exist, then he has to say baqa to it so that it will remain for another second. And then God has to say baqa to it so it'll remain for another second after that. And then if it's going to last for 3 seconds, God's going to have to say baqa until God decides it's not time for it to exist, in which case God says fana. Fana. Done, gone. This paradox of how things cease to be when God, so what is God saying fana to? It's the same problem that God has when God has to say kun to something, when God has to bring it into being. God's taking something out of existence is the same problem as God's bringing something into being. And if these are accidents, a thing's remaining is an accident that inheres in a thing, and the thing's destruction is something that inheres in the thing. What exactly are they inhering in? You can't walk around with fana as an accident, by definition. That's one of the problems with atomism, and it was resolved by treating motion and rest not as things at all, not as part of the cosmological scheme. But the resultant effect was something even worse, which was absolute chaos and lack of time. So let's look at this from another perspective. There was I mentioned at the beginning the problem of human free will, and there's a classic example of how this works in early kalām, and that's for the Muʿtazilites, that's the nature of secondary causality. So causality implies the existence of a thing over time. In other words, the example that's always used is if I shoot you with an arrow, I inhere the punishment that is deserved or the culpability for having shot you with an arrow even after I've shot you. In other words, it implies that we adhere to a strict version of time, a strict vision of time. So if I, for instance, die before the arrow strikes you, if I shoot an arrow at Omar and I die or get hit over the head by a piano before the arrow strikes him, I am still culpable for that. Yet I don't exist. So the cause of that action in time is something that doesn't exist in reality. This is the sort of problem with tawallud that is discussed by the early kalām folk. Nevertheless, this problem, which I think I have an example of, do I have this? No. No, but I have this other thing about motion. This problem of the existence of the necessary existence of the cause, even after the effect, sorry, the persistence of the cause, even if the cause ceases to be, requires an understanding of time or an understanding of secondary causality. Now, the weird thing about secondary causality is it actually dispenses with the obvious choice and says that, in fact, it wasn't me who shot the arrow, or maybe it was me that shot the arrow, but the arrow's progress on each step of the path before it hits its target is the result of the previous moment on the path. In other words, it completely gets rid of the idea of culpability for the person shooting the arrow. In the same way, when mutakallimun talk about motion, they discuss whether or not it's possible for a body to remain in two places. For a body to remain for two moments in one place. In other words, can motion be at rest? That sounds completely bizarre, right? But what they're actually asking is, if a body is always in motion, sorry, if a body is at rest, is it not also always in motion? Because it's always on its way to being somewhere else. If it were in rest for consecutive moments, then it would be unable to ever move. It would always have to be about to be going somewhere or on its way of having returned from somewhere. If a body comes to a place and remains in it for 2 moments, its motion becomes rest. That's what most normal people would say. But some people said it's impossible for any bodies to ever be at rest. They're always moving. This again goes back to the concept of time. I have one more example for time, and that has to do with the nature of thought. So when Mu'tazilites, when early mutakallimun think about the nature of thought, they think about how, for instance, when I was discussing the shooting of arrows example, they think about how it is that that I can choose to make such an act. Because remember, I began by talking about free will. The capacity to act that you have has to exist before you actually do the thing, right? That seems normal. It seems like I have to be able to bonk you over the head before I actually bonk you over the head. And it seems like something not worth saying. Except that means that I can currently have the capacity to bonk each one of you over the head. I just haven't chosen which. That seems like a lot of kudra, a lot of specific instances of capacity to act that I have, or istita. I have the ability to bonk each one of you over the head, and I have the capacity to not bonk each one of you over the head. It seems to us bizarre to quantify these things. And yet, if we don't quantify these things, it's like Schrodinger's cat. Is it Schrodinger? Heisenberg's. Schrodinger's cat. It has to be possible, which means that there has to be a conceptual entity for it, which goes back to the previous quote that I gave you, the ma'ana. There has to be a ma'ana or a khatir, some sort of an impulse to do one or the other that pre-exists the moment of the thing happening. This is sort of quintessentially essential for the nature of Mu'tazilism, because it's why we have the culpability for doing the things that we do. For Ash'arites, now remember at the beginning of the talk, I was concerned with whether Ash'arites and Mu'tazilites are different. They are different in so many obvious ways, and this is one of the ways. For Ash'arites, the problem is not that at all, because you don't have the capacity to bonk somebody over the head. In fact, God bonks people over the head through you. I'm not being kind to Ash'arites, but I mean, that is basically what they're saying. They're saying that because God knows what you're going to do, and because God is the only fa'il in the universe, then it would be weird to say that you have any capacity to do anything of your own. Instead, you sort of acquire this capacity, hopefully before the fact, but most likely after the fact in writing, when God's like the policeman who's writing down what you did after you've already done it. I was like, yeah, you definitely could have chosen not to do that, even though you had no agency. This is the Asherite position, unfortunately. It's not very pleasant. However, I think it is quite pleasant, because I think that it actually acknowledges the atomist problem. It says that, in fact, time itself is such a construct to us that it has no bearing on agency at all. It's just as each individual atom is momentary and discrete in the universe, and its accidents are given by God in the universe, so are each of our acts. So our remaining is as arbitrary as our fana. Our acting in one way is as arbitrary as our acting in another way. And that goes back to the most obvious problem that I began with, which is the difference between us acting well and us acting poorly is, it's not that it's a matter of chance, but it's arbitrary. It's not something in our control in the Asherite system. The Mu'tazilites, we always like to hope, created this opportunity for control over our acts, but they belong to the same physical system as as our friends, the Ash'arites. I got a little bit off topic there. I have one last thing to say. So I've been reading a lot about the origins of atomism. This is Afghanistan. That's like, so that's Mazar Sharif. And then like Badakhshan is over there, right? So we roughly know where we are. I should have put it in some sort of scale. Jam ibn Safwan, remember him? He was the guy that said that we can't say anything about God and so on. And he was an absolute determinist. He came from Termith, which is here. Right. Sorry, cameras, but for the people in the room, it's here. For the people that aren't in the room, you can find it on Google. In the 7th century, the center for one of the hugest Western centers for Buddhist thought was Balkh. This is where the Barmakids famously came from. Balkh is here. That's like, I mean, even by 7th century standards, that's not far. The presence of Buddhist atomism in early kalām is unmistakable. I've been reading more and more about this. This was first announced by like early Germans who were weird Orientalists, and then Shlomo Pinis came up with it in the 1930s and discussed the possibilities of Indian antecedents for Islamic atomism. Everybody, when they read about Islamic atomism, they're confused as to why it's so different from Greek atomism. Why, on the most crucial points, does it diverge from the principles of Greek atomism? Why does it concern itself with the transience of each individual atom and accident, for that matter? Actually, it's more of accidents, but most recently, I mean, so I gave Shlomo Pinis, who else? Most scholars now agree that it's definitely not Greek atomism, but they don't know exactly where it came from. And in Kalām itself, it's just thought of as the way that we talk about the universe. But most recently, Dong Shuyan, who's a Chinese scholar, has actually come out and just said that this is Buddhist atomism. He's a specialist in Abhidharma, which is the Buddhist tradition. Well, Abhidharma, the word itself means dharma in Sanskrit is the teaching of the Buddha, and Abhid just means like the commentaries on the teaching of the Buddha. So it's one of the major, well, I'm way out of my league here, but it's a major part of Buddhism. Okay. And the funny thing about it is that the term Dharma, which means the teaching of the Buddha, is also the term that they use, that Buddhists use, for the constituent elements of the universe. In other words, the jawāhirs. There's no, like, after having read Dong Shuyan's piece, and after having looked at the material, there's no question that we're talking about the same thing. When you read Abhidharma literature, you see lists and lists and lists of jawāhirs, of all of the sensible properties that could be jawāhirs. You see over and over again a tendency to get rid of concepts of psychology, concepts of difference, like the difference between two giraffes. You see, in fact, that the sensible attributes of things are the ultimate constituents of the universe, and those things are, in Buddhism, created in the mind. They don't reflect anything on in the outside world, but that's not my business. That's Buddhist business. I'm not going to describe Buddhist metaphysics. However, it's notable that in the 7th century, when kalām was taking shape, this entire part of the world is Buddhist. So I'm going to leave it on that and just give you one last, do I have any? There it is. So going back to this, the difference between the two giraffes. So from a kalām point of view, there's no difference between those two giraffes at all. The only difference between those two giraffes is that one of them is going to hell and the other one is going to heaven. That's the only difference. It's a location difference. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this fascinating lecture. And I hand the floor over to Dr. Adamson, please.
Okay, so thanks, David. That was very interesting and very entertaining. I'll try to be the same, or failing that, I'll be one or the other, I hope. So one thing I've always liked about David's work is that he really approaches kalām as if it were just philosophy without worrying about that, which I think is exactly right. So something that I always say is that if we imagine a world in which Greek philosophical works had never been translated into Arabic and created this tradition that we call falsafa, so you can actually hear the Arabic word is just taken from Greek, right? Falsafa is just philosophia, the Greek word for philosophy. If we imagine that that had never happened, and then modern historians of philosophy had sort of turned their attention to the Islamic world the way they turned their attention to India and China and so on, or we would hope that they would turn their attention to those cultures anyway. And they sort of looked in Arabic and Persian literature for the philosophy. What would they think was philosophy? And I think the answer is kalām, right? So they would actually just think that kalām, they would probably translate kalām as philosophy, actually. The reason that we don't do that is because there was also falsafa. And there are lots of reasons to think that kalām was maybe not only a kind of philosophy, but among other things, a kind of philosophy. One is that they discuss so many philosophical topics, as we just saw. So we have, I won't be able to list them all, I don't think, but free will, atomism, the problem of individuation, and proofs for the existence of God, the relationship between gods and his attributes, moral responsibility, et cetera, right? So these are all standard philosophical topics, and they're using rational arguments to talk about them, as philosophers would. But not only that, it's also all interconnected in very complicated ways. And David's talk really gets that across, right? So you see that you can kind of start anywhere in kalām and wind up thinking about everything else. So you're thinking about the nature of time and atomism and moral responsibility and bodies and motion, and they're all connected, which is typical of philosophy as well, right? It's a very different kind of philosophy than we have in falsafa. It's actually anti-Aristotelian in many ways, not least because Aristotelianism is not atomistic. So Aristotle thought that you can take any body, divide it, take one of the parts that you can created, divide that, take one of those parts and divide again, and you can keep going forever, at least in principle. Obviously, that's in real life because your knives aren't sharp enough, but you could keep doing that if you had a sharp enough knife. We'd never have to stop because there's no smallest part that can't be divided. And that's exactly what at least Greek atomists deny. So it's a different kind of philosophy from Aristotelian philosophy, from falsafa, but it is a kind of philosophy, in my opinion. So I think we agree about that. So I think that's a very valuable insight. So I'm glad that you got that across. Because everything's interconnected, there was a lot of stuff in there that I can pick up on in my comments. I think I'd like to say something about the thing you discussed most, which is probably this issue about what we now philosophers call the problem of individuation. So this is, again, the problem is if you've got two giraffes, what makes one giraffe different from the other? Well, certainly not the fact that they're both giraffes, right? It has to be something else. And nothing else that they have in common, right? So if they're both on the savannah, it's not going to be that either. And I think a good question to ask about this issue might be, why would anyone care about this? So this may be why you kept saying these problems are annoying. I mean, I guess I don't find them annoying, but I can see how someone might, because someone might say, like, why are you worried? Like, I don't get up out of bed in the morning worrying about like why one of my socks is different from the other sock. Acceptance of, there are those socks that say L and R on them. What's up with that, people? It seems to be specifically designed to convince you that you've got your socks on the wrong feet. And other than that, it seems to make no difference whatsoever. I find that very stressful, actually. I think if one thing comes out of this evening, it would be that I give you all permission to wear the L sock on the right foot and vice versa. But where was I? Okay, so why would we care about this? And I think the answer is actually not clear, but it is something that people were worrying about already before the philosophers that David was talking about. So it goes back to antiquity. And here's a stab at why you might care about this. So first thing to notice is that there's actually two problems of identity, and David talked about both of them. One is this issue about why is this giraffe different from this giraffe? They exist at the same time, and we're trying to figure out why these two similar things are different, right? So there's two items, they share something, they're similar to each other, we have to differentiate them. That's the problem of identity at a time. Then there's another problem, which you also mentioned, which is imagine the same giraffe first, like napping, and then waking up and eating leaves off a tree. So now we have the question of why is this giraffe the same as this later giraffe? This is identity over time. Notice that here the problem is the reverse. So here we're wondering why are these two items the same thing, even though they're different? One is napping, the other's eating leaves off a tree. So they're kind of inverse of each other. And either way, it looks like, to me, it looks like the reason they started worrying about this is that there's a kind of mismatch between the way we conceive of the world or know it and what actually exists. Let me explain. So when we're looking at the world, we try to, as Plato famously says, divide the world up at its natural joints like a good butcher, not a bad butcher. So these are the giraffes, these are the oxen, these are the elephants, these are the rhinoceros, right? These are the humans, these are the animals, and so on. So we have these general categories, and our knowledge usually concerns these categories, right? So I just gave you examples of natural kinds, like species kinds, but also features like eating leaves off a tree. Lots of things eat leaves off trees, right? There are many, many things eating leaves off trees, even as we speak. Or being in London, right? So accidental properties and not just essential properties. So not just being a giraffe, but also being in London. These are things that are true of lots of things. And actually, if you think about like everything that you can know, it's a general feature of many things. Or if it's not, it could be. So as Aristotle says, there's only one sun. But if there were more than one sun, everything that's true of the one sun that exists would be true of the other suns as well. Okay. So on the one hand, our knowledge concerns generalities, but what's out there in the world is singular objects, right? So there's just one general concept of human, but here we have, I don't know, 40, 50 humans, right? So what we're trying to do when we explain what it is that differentiates two things of a type, two things that are similar, is to explain how it is that we, as it were, start with generalities and get to something specific. And one reason I think that this is why the ancients were worried about this is that one of the most popular solutions is one that we find in a philosopher named Porphyry, who's an early late ancient Neoplatonist. And he had what is sometimes called a bundle theory of individuation. So here's the idea, since you were embarrassing people by taking there as examples, I'm going to embarrass you now and take you as an example. I know there's all these other people, but you're very close to me. Right? Okay, so there's lots of things that are true of David, right? He's sitting, but I'm sitting. So that doesn't pick out David. He's wearing a watch, but I'm wearing a watch. So that doesn't pick out. He's wearing glasses. That doesn't. So, okay, we're trying to differentiate this. How are we going to? Oh, he has like a nice head of hair, right? Okay, so now we've told me apart from him, right? But I was sort of anticipating that, oh, look. Right. So it can't be that humans are differentiated just by having hair or not, right? Because, right? And also David and weirdly everyone else in the room other than me. What's going on? What's in the water in this building? You all have hair. Very good. Okay, so that's not going to do it either. And we could kind of keep going, but we're going to be very hard pressed to name a feature of David that's not shared by anyone else, other than maybe like sort of the trivial fact that he's David, right? Not that he's named David. Actually, way too many people are named David, let's face it. My brother in college decided to give everyone he knew who was named David a nickname because it was too confusing. A lot of the nicknames stuff, very impressive. So what I mean is like the fact of being him, but that's what we're trying to explain. So that can't be what it is. So Porphyry said, okay, I've got it. Although every feature that David has is shared by someone else, nothing has all of his features. So you could kind of go down the list and the full combination, the bundle of all the features belongs only to David. So that seems like a really clever answer, right? And you can see that it kind of, if not proves, then at least suggests that what I was just saying is true, namely that all of our ideas are general, and what we're trying to do is somehow magically get individuals out of these ideas. And he says, it isn't magic. If you combine all of the general features that belong to David, you'll get a unique set of them, and that will pick him out from everything else. Okay. Now let's jump ahead a bit to the Islamic world, to my favorite philosopher, who is, of course, Ibn Sina, aka Avicenna. He talks about this solution, and he says that's not a good solution, and I'll tell you why. Even though it's true that David has all of the properties that he has, and it's also true that nobody else does, that doesn't show that nobody else could have had those properties. So he gives the example, he's obviously thinking of Socrates, of a wise philosopher who was put to death on a certain day in a certain city. And he says, okay, let's take it for granted that no other wise philosopher was executed. You know, their limit for executing wise philosophers in the city is one per day, right? But Socrates didn't have to be the wise philosopher who was put to death in that city. He also didn't have to be the only wise philosopher who was put to death in that city. And the same goes for any list of properties, no matter how long, right? So that's not a good answer, he says. And actually, it's not so clear what Ibn Sina's real answer is for individuation. But one idea that he toys around with is that we don't, instead of messing with these general properties, you're never going to get individuation out of generalities, right? So what you need is something that's already specific. And one thought that he at least discussed with his students, and we can find this in some of his later works, is spatiotemporal location. So he's here now, and nothing else is here now, right? Now, this raises all kinds of problems. So for one thing, is it really true that nothing else is right here, right now? Right, so for example, David is here, but also David's body parts are here. And it's not so clear whether those are the same thing or not. there's lots of ways of describing David, but he's also the guy who just gave this talk. He's the father of his children, etc. You have to somehow like convince yourself that those are all identical, but they probably are. So that's a problem, but it's probably a problem we need to solve anyway. But there's a bigger problem, and this is something that was pointed out by a later philosopher named Fakhruddin Arazi, who's maybe my second favorite philosopher. He says, well, when you're playing this game of individuation, ultimately, you're always going to have to hit something, which is kind of like the bedrock, which is just automatically individuated. So when I say David's right here, right now, I've just made a reference to his location and his time, the time at which he's existing. But why are and you mentioned this, why is the time an individual time? Why is the place an individual place? There are other places, there are other times, right? So why is, now we're way too late, but why is 6:09 on June, whatever it is? What distinguishes that time from other times? And Fakhruddin actually says something really interesting, which is that at some point you just have to say that there are individuals, and that's just a brute fact about the universe. And although he doesn't say this, it suggests something, an idea that you find in Latin medieval scholastic philosophy, which is that the whole problem was always misconceived. Instead of starting with generalities and trying to get individuals, we start with individuals because that's what exists, and we extract generalities from them. So actually, you're just an individual. And then we start describing you with words. And these words are words we use for other things that are similar, but there are no generalities. This is nominalism. So there are no real generalities. Generalities are just ideas we have. And what's out in the world is already always a particular, it's always an individual. So there was never a problem in the first place, which of course is a way that philosophers love to solve problems, namely to show that there aren't any. Okay.
Thank you. And I think we need to find out now whether David's promise to answer all the questions was an accident or was it
Substantial.
I should respond to what Peter mentioned, just to say, am I on? The issue about generalities is a major issue, but then there's no reason for us to be both called humans. Then we're just a pile of accidents. That's what a nominalist would have to say. It would just be a coincidence that we're both humans. I mean, the concept of human isn't a property.
Yeah, that's right. So they would say there are individual humans, and that when we use the word human, we're picking out the fact that these two individuals are similar.
It's a term of art.
Yeah,
It's not a.
right. Yeah, I mean, you have problems either way. So if you're a nominalist, you have problems of why is it true to say things like humans are animals? Like, what is that even about? Given that there's no such thing as human. And they have to say, well, every individual human is an individual animal.
So let me thank again our speakers, David and Peter. And Peter, thanks for having found the time to join us today during your short stay in London. Thanks to everyone for joining us today in person and online. And also many thanks for everyone who supported this event behind the scenes, to our the Department of Communication and Development, and to the events team, to Shiraz Kabani, Sushil Gokarakonda, and Arhid Zamani, Nigina Mirgoskhanova, and Sida Estergomi. Many thanks, and hopefully see you at our next event. Thank you.
Thank you.